The sound of Karen Mitchell's heels clicking against the concrete echoed through the quiet afternoon air as she approached the two boys sitting on the weathered wooden bench. Her eyes narrowed as she took in the scene before her two 12-year-old twins, clearly overweight, methodically eating their sandwiches while their backpacks lay scattered at their feet. The rage that had been building inside her for weeks finally found its target. "Excuse me," she barked, her voice cutting through the peaceful atmosphere like a blade. The boys looked up, startled, their mouths still full of food. "What do you think you're doing?" Marcus, the slightly taller of the twins, swallowed hard before answering. "We're just eating lunch, ma'am. Waiting for our dad." "Just eating lunch." Karen's voice rose an octave, drawing the attention of several passers-by near the library entrance. "You've been sitting here every day for 2 weeks, stuffing your faces like animals. Do you have any idea what you're doing to this community?" Miles, Marcus's twin brother, shifted uncomfortably on the bench. His sandwich, now partially unwrapped, seemed suddenly heavy in his small hands. "We're not doing anything wrong. Our dad works nearby, and we wait here after school." Karen stepped closer, her shadow falling across both boys. At 43, she had spent the last 5 years as the self-appointed enforcer of the Willow Creek HOA regulations, transforming what should have been a simple volunteer position into her personal crusade against anything she deemed inappropriate. Her perfectly styled blonde hair caught the afternoon sunlight as she leaned forward, pointing an accusatory finger at the boys. "Wrong. You're attracting pests with all that food. Rats, ants, flies. This is a public space, not your personal dining room. And frankly, the sight of you two gorging yourselves is disturbing to other community members." The cruelty in her words hit both boys like physical blows. Marcus felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment, while Miles instinctively pulled his jacket tighter around his body. They had heard such comments before, whispered by classmates or muttered by strangers, but never delivered with such venom by an adult in broad daylight. "We'll finish quickly and clean up after ourselves," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "No. You'll leave. Now." Karen's tone brooked no argument. "This bench is for community members who know how to behave appropriately, not for whatever this is." A small crowd had begun to gather near the library steps. Margaret Chen, an elderly librarian who had worked at the branch for over 20 years, watched the confrontation with growing concern. She recognized the boys they came by almost every day, always polite, always quiet. Their father, David Rodriguez, was one of the most respectful parents she had ever encountered during her decades of service. "Ma'am," Margaret called out, stepping closer, "those boys aren't causing any trouble. They've been coming here for weeks, and they're always well behaved." Karen whirled around, her eyes flashing with irritation. "And you are—" "Margaret Chen. I'm the head librarian here. I know these children, and they're not bothering anyone." "Well, Margaret Chen," Karen said, emphasizing each syllable with disdain. "You might know books, but you clearly don't understand community standards. These boys are eating in public, making a spectacle of themselves, and creating unsanitary conditions. As an HOA representative, I have the authority to remove them." Margaret frowned. "This isn't HOA property. This is a public library." "The bench is within the community boundaries," Karen snapped, though her legal knowledge was sketchy at best. "And regardless, I'm calling this in as a trespassing incident." She pulled out her phone with theatrical flourish, dialing the non-emergency police line. The boys watched in growing horror as she began speaking in an urgent, concerned tone that bore no resemblance to the harsh voice she had used with them moments before. "Yes. Hello. I need to report a trespassing incident at the Willow Creek Library. Two juvenile males, approximately 12 years old, refusing to leave public property after being asked multiple times. They appear to be loitering and creating unsanitary conditions. Yes, I'll wait for an officer. Marcus stood up slowly, his sandwich forgotten. We should go. Miles. We can wait somewhere else. But as the boys began to gather their belongings, Karen made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life, believing she had the authority to detain them until police arrived. She reached out and grabbed Marcus by the arm. Oh no, you don't. You're staying right here until the officers arrive to sort this out. Marcus tried to pull away, but Karen's grip tightened. Let go of me. You can't touch us. I can, and I will, Karen said through gritted teeth. You've been disrupting this community long enough. What happened next occurred so quickly that several witnesses would later give conflicting accounts. Karen, either losing her balance or becoming more aggressive, yanked Marcus toward her with enough force that he stumbled. As he tried to steady himself, his lunch bag fell to the ground, his sandwich spilling across the concrete. Miles jumped up from the bench. Stop hurting him! Karen, now fully committed to her course of action, grabbed Miles as well. In her mind, she was performing a citizen's arrest, maintaining order in her community. In reality, she was assaulting two children whose only crime had been eating lunch in a public space. Both of you need to learn some respect, she hissed, her manicured nails digging into Miles's arm hard enough to leave marks. This is what happens when parents don't teach their children proper behavior. Margaret Chen rushed forward. Stop this immediately. You cannot put your hands on these children. Several other witnesses had pulled out their phones, recording the encounter. The modern age of instant documentation was about to play a crucial role in what would unfold over the coming weeks. Marcus, tears streaming down his face, tried once more to break free. As he twisted away from Karen's grasp, she lost her footing and stumbled backward. In her rage and embarrassment, she lashed out, shoving Marcus hard enough that he fell to his knees on the rough concrete. The sound of his impact echoed across the small plaza. Blood immediately began seeping through the torn fabric of his jeans, where his knees had scraped against the pavement. Miles cried out and knelt beside his brother, helping him up while shooting frightened glances at Karen. Now look what you've done, Karen said, her voice cold and unsympathetic. This could have all been avoided if you had just followed simple instructions. It was at this moment that David Rodriguez arrived for his daily pickup. As a senior clerk for the Supreme Court, he typically worked long hours, but he made it a point to collect his sons from their after-school routine at exactly the same time each day. The sight that greeted him as he rounded the corner would be seared into his memory forever. His sons, both crying, with Marcus bleeding from his knees and Miles clutching his bruised arm. A middle-aged woman standing over them with an expression of righteous satisfaction. Their lunch scattered across the ground, like debris from some small tragedy. What the hell is going on here? David's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to courtrooms and legal proceedings. Karen turned toward him, taking in his appearance, a tall, professionally dressed Hispanic man in his late 30s. With the bearing of someone used to being taken seriously. Her confidence wavered slightly, but her commitment to her narrative remained firm. Are you the father of these boys? She asked. I am, and I want to know why they're hurt and why you're standing over them like that. Karen straightened her shoulders. Your sons were trespassing and creating unsanitary conditions. When I attempted to detain them for police questioning, they became combative and injured themselves while resisting. David looked around at the crowd of witnesses, many of whom were still recording with their phones. Margaret Chen stepped forward. That's not what happened at all, she said firmly. This woman approached your boys while they were eating lunch and began harassing them. She put her hands on them when they tried to leave, and she pushed Marcus down. David knelt beside his sons, examining Marcus's scraped knees while checking Miles's arm for injuries. Both boys were trembling, whether from shock, fear, or adrenaline. As a man who had spent years working within the justice system, he recognized the signs of trauma when he saw them. "Boys, are you hurt anywhere else?" he asked gently. "She grabbed us really hard, Dad," Miles whispered. "She said we were disgusting and making the community look bad." Marcus nodded, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. "She threw our food on the ground and said we were like animals." David stood slowly, his expression transforming from concern to something far more dangerous. When he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and absolutely terrifying in its controlled fury. "Ma'am, I'm going to need your name and contact information. You've just committed assault and battery against 2 minors, and I'll be filing charges." Karen scoffed. "Charges I was performing a citizen's arrest. These boys were trespassing and—" "On public property," David interrupted. "While eating lunch and waiting for their father, you have no legal authority to detain anyone, let alone children, and you certainly have no right to put your hands on them." "I know my rights," Karen shot back. "I'm an HOA representative, and I was enforcing community standards." David pulled out his phone. "Then you'll have no problem explaining that to the police when they arrive. I'm calling this in as an assault on minors." As David made his call, describing the incident with the precise, clinical language of someone familiar with legal procedures, Karen began to realize that the situation might not unfold as she had expected. The crowd of witnesses seemed uniformly hostile to her version of events, and the man speaking to the police clearly knew exactly what he was doing. Within minutes, 2 patrol officers arrived. Officer Janet Rodriguez, no relation to David despite the shared surname, and Officer Mike Thompson had responded to hundreds of calls in their careers. But the scene they encountered was unusual, even by their standards. "Who called this?" an Officer Rodriguez asked. Both Karen and David raised their hands simultaneously. "I called to report trespassing and disorderly conduct," Karen said quickly. "And I called to report assault and battery against my 2 sons," David added. Officer Thompson looked around at the crowd, taking note of the phones still recording. "All right, let's separate everyone and get some statements. Ma'am," he addressed Karen, "you come with me. Sir, you and your boys can speak with Officer Rodriguez." As the officers conducted their interviews, a clearer picture began to emerge. Multiple witnesses corroborated the same story. Karen had approached the boys unprovoked, berated them about their appearance and eating habits, physically grabbed them when they tried to leave, and caused Marcus's injuries through her aggressive actions. Margaret Chen provided the most detailed account. "I've been watching this woman escalate her behavior over the past few weeks. She's been making complaints about these boys to anyone who will listen, calling them unsightly and claiming they're damaging community property just by sitting on that bench." Meanwhile, Karen's story began to fall apart under gentle but persistent questioning from Officer Thompson. Her claims about trespassing dissolved when she admitted the bench was on public property. Her assertion of authority as an HOA representative became meaningless when Thompson explained that HOA powers didn't extend to public spaces. Most damaging of all, her claim of self-defense crumbled when multiple witnesses contradicted her version of events. Officer Rodriguez, speaking with David and his sons, was building a strong case for assault charges. Marcus's scraped knees provided physical evidence of Karen's actions, while Miles's bruised arm showed clear finger marks where she had grabbed him. "Dad, are we in trouble?" Miles asked quietly. No, son, you did nothing wrong. Sometimes adults make very bad decisions, and when they do, there are consequences. David's calm demeanor masked the fury burning inside him. As someone who had spent years working within the legal system, he understood exactly how to pursue justice through proper channels. But as a father, watching his children struggle with the aftermath of an unprovoked attack, he felt a rage that no professional training could entirely contain. After 45 minutes of interviews and evidence collection, the officers reconvened. The decision was straightforward. Karen would be cited for assault and battery, and the case would be forwarded to the district attorney's office for potential prosecution. "This is outrageous," Karen protested as Officer Thompson handed her the citation. "I was trying to maintain community standards. These boys have been a nuisance for weeks." "Ma'am, eating lunch in a public space is not a crime," Thompson replied patiently. "Putting your hands on someone else's children without permission is. You need to sign this citation and appear in court on the date indicated." As the police finished their work and began to disperse the crowd, David gathered his sons and their scattered belongings. The lunch that had started this entire incident lay trampled and forgotten on the concrete. A small symbol of how quickly a normal day could transform into something traumatic. "Can we go home now, Dad?" Marcus asked, still sniffling. "Yes, we can go home. But first, I need to take some pictures of your injuries for our records." David's experience in the legal system was about to prove invaluable. That evening, after tending to his son's physical and emotional wounds, he began documenting everything, photographing their injuries, writing detailed accounts of the incident, collecting contact information from witnesses, and researching Karen's background and her role in the HOA. What he discovered during his research would change everything. Karen Mitchell, it turned out, had a history of complaints and confrontations throughout the community. Over the past 2 years, she had filed dozens of reports against neighbors for minor infractions, grass that was supposedly too long, holiday decorations left up too late, children playing too loudly in their own yards. Most disturbing of all, a pattern emerged in her complaints. She consistently targeted families with children, elderly residents, and anyone she deemed undesirable for the community's image. David also discovered something that Karen had been careful to hide. She had no official authority beyond her volunteer position on the HOA board. Her claims of enforcement power were entirely fabricated, supported by nothing more than her own sense of entitlement and the community's general reluctance to challenge her aggressive behavior. But Karen had made one crucial error in her choice of targets. David Rodriguez wasn't just any concerned parent, he was a senior clerk for the Supreme Court, with extensive knowledge of civil rights law and direct access to resources that most people could only dream of. More importantly, he had spent years helping to process cases involving the abuse of authority and civil rights violations. The next morning, David made a series of phone calls that would set in motion a chain of events far beyond what Karen could have imagined. He contacted the district attorney's office to ensure the assault charges were being pursued aggressively. He reached out to civil rights attorneys who specialized in cases involving discrimination and abuse of authority. Most significantly, he filed a formal complaint with the state's Civil Rights Division, alleging that Karen's pattern of behavior constituted harassment and discrimination against children and minorities. Karen, meanwhile, was receiving a very different kind of education about the consequences of her actions. The video footage of the incident, recorded by multiple witnesses, had been shared widely on social media. Within 24 hours, the story had been picked up by local news outlets, then regional networks, and finally, national media. The narrative was irresistible to news producers, a power-hungry HOA enforcer attacking 2 children for the crime of eating lunch while being overweight. The visual evidence was damning, showing clearly that Karen had been the aggressor in every phase of the encounter. Karen's phone began ringing constantly, reporters seeking comment, neighbors expressing their outrage, and, most troubling of all, attorneys representing other families who claimed to have been harassed by her over the years. 2 weeks after the bench incident, David received a call that would provide the final piece of the puzzle. The attorney handling his civil case had uncovered something remarkable. Karen had been operating without any real authority for months. The HOA board had actually voted to remove her from her enforcement role 6 months earlier, but she had continued acting as if she still held the position. "She's been impersonating an official for half a year," the attorney explained. "Every citation she's issued, every complaint she's filed, every confrontation she's initiated, all of it was done without any legal backing whatsoever." This revelation transformed the case from a simple assault into something much larger: fraud, impersonation of an official, and potentially criminal harassment of dozens of community members. The climax of the entire saga came during a packed community meeting held 3 weeks after the initial incident. The Willow Creek Community Center had never seen such a crowd. Over 200 residents packed into a space designed for half that number. David sat in the front row with his sons, both of whom had insisted on attending, despite their father's reservations. Karen entered the meeting accompanied by her attorney, a nervous-looking man who had clearly advised her to remain silent. But Karen, true to form, could not resist the opportunity to defend herself before her community. When called upon to address the gathering, she stood with the same self-righteous bearing that had characterized her confrontation with the boys. "I want everyone to understand that I have spent years trying to maintain the standards that make this community special," she began. "Sometimes that means making difficult decisions that not everyone will appreciate." Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the crowd, but Karen continued. "The incident with these boys has been blown out of proportion by media attention and legal maneuvering. I was simply trying to address a situation that had become disruptive to our community's peace and reputation." David had been prepared for this moment. When given the opportunity to respond, he stood slowly, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "Ms. Mitchell, you attacked my children for eating lunch, not for being disruptive, not for breaking any law, but for eating lunch while being overweight. You grabbed them, you threw their food on the ground, and you physically injured them because you found their appearance offensive." He turned to address the broader crowd. "But this isn't really about my sons. It's about a pattern of behavior that has been terrorizing this community for years. How many of you have been harassed by this woman? How many of you have been cited for imaginary infractions or threatened with consequences she had no authority to impose?" Hands began rising throughout the room, first a few, then dozens, until more than half the people present were indicating they had been targeted by Karen's fabricated authority. Margaret Chen stood up. "She told me the library was violating community standards by allowing undesirable elements to congregate on public property. She demanded I ban certain children from the premises." An elderly man near the back called out, "She threatened to have my grandson arrested for skateboarding in front of my house." A woman with 2 young children added, "She told me my kids were too loud and that she'd have them removed from the community if I didn't control them better." Story after story emerged, painting a picture of systematic harassment that had gone unchallenged for too long. Karen sat in stunned silence as the community she thought she had been protecting turned against her with unified fury. The final blow came when the HOA president stood to address the room. "I want everyone to know that Ms. Mitchell has not held any official position with this organization for 6 months. Her enforcement actions, her citations, her threats, none of it had any legal backing. She has been impersonating an official and using that false authority to harass our neighbors." The room erupted in angry voices and demands for justice. Karen's attorney tugged at her sleeve, urging her to leave, but she remained frozen in her chair, finally understanding the magnitude of what she had unleashed. David stood once more, raising his hand for quiet. When the room settled, his voice was measured but implacable. "My sons will recover from their physical injuries. The emotional damage will take longer to heal. But every family in this room deserves to know that actions have consequences. That authority cannot be fabricated or abused. And that children especially deserve protection from adults who would hurt them." He looked directly at Karen. "You picked the wrong family to target. Not because of who I am or where I work, but because you finally encountered someone with the resources and knowledge to hold you accountable for years of abuse." The legal consequences came swiftly after that community meeting. Karen was charged with assault and battery, fraud, impersonation of an official, and criminal harassment. The civil lawsuits followed. David's family sued for assault and intentional infliction of emotional distress, while dozens of other families joined a class action suit for harassment and fraud. The criminal trial became a media sensation, with video evidence, witness testimony, and Karen's own documented history of harassment, creating an overwhelming case against her. She was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 18 months in prison, along with 5 years of probation and mandatory anger management counseling. The civil judgments were even more devastating. Karen lost her house to cover the damage awards. Her car was repossessed, and she was forced to declare bankruptcy. The woman who had spent years terrorizing others with fabricated authority found herself stripped of everything she had once used to project power and status. But the most profound changes occurred within the community itself. The Willow Creek HOA underwent a complete restructuring, implementing oversight mechanisms to prevent any individual from accumulating unchecked authority. New policies were established to protect residents from harassment, with particular emphasis on protecting children and vulnerable community members. Margaret Chen worked with the library system to create new programs specifically designed to make the space more welcoming to all community members. The bench where Marcus and Miles had been attacked became a symbol of resilience, with a small plaque reading, "Community Welcome Space, all are welcome here." For David and his sons, the healing process was gradual but meaningful. Marcus and Miles initially struggled with anxiety about eating in public spaces, but with counseling and their father's patient support, they slowly regained their confidence. The experience had taught them painful lessons about injustice and cruelty, but also powerful lessons about standing up for what's right and the importance of community support. 6 months after the bench incident, the boys returned to their after-school routine at the library. The first day back was difficult. Both boys were nervous about attracting unwanted attention, but as they settled onto the familiar bench with their lunches, something remarkable happened. Other families joined them. Parents who had heard their story made a point of eating lunch in the same space, creating an informal but powerful statement about community values. Children who had once whispered cruel comments about their weight now approached with genuine friendship, having learned from their parents about the importance of kindness and inclusion. Margaret Chen watched from the library steps, smiling as she observed the transformation. The space that had once been the site of cruelty and harassment had become a symbol of community healing and acceptance. David arrived that first day back to find his sons surrounded by new friends, sharing food and homework and laughter. The sight brought tears to his eyes, not of sadness for what they had endured, but of joy for what they had helped create. "How was your day, boys?" he asked as they gathered their things. "Good, Dad." Marcus replied, "Really good. Miles nodded enthusiastically. Mrs. Chen said we're heroes for standing up to bullies. Is that true? David considered the question carefully. I think heroes are people who help make the world a little bit better, even when it's hard. What do you think? The boys looked around at the diverse group of families sharing the space, at the other children who now felt safe to be themselves, at the community that had rallied to support them in their darkest moment. Yeah, Marcus said quietly. I think maybe we did help make things better. As they walked home together, David reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The bench incident had lasted only minutes, but its consequences had reshaped an entire community's understanding of justice, authority, and the responsibility to protect the vulnerable. Karen Mitchell had intended to teach two children a lesson about knowing their place in society. Instead, she had inadvertently taught an entire community about the danger of unchecked authority and the power of standing together against injustice. The story became a case study in civil rights law schools, an example of how individual courage and community action could combine to create lasting change. But for David, Marcus, and Miles Rodriguez, it remained something much simpler and more profound proof that doing the right thing, even when it's difficult, can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. Years later, Marcus and Miles would tell their own children about the day their world changed on a library bench. They would explain how cruelty and prejudice had tried to silence them, but how justice and community support had given them their voices back. Most importantly, they would teach the next generation that standing up to bullies, whether they're playground tormentors or adults who abuse their authority, is not just a right, but a responsibility. The bench still sits outside the Willow Creek Library, weathered but sturdy. The plaque remains, its message as relevant today as it was when first installed. And every day, children gather there to eat their lunches, do their homework, and learn that in a truly just community, everyone has a place at the table. Karen Mitchell served her time and disappeared from public view, her name now synonymous with the abuse of authority and the consequences that follow. Her legacy lives on as a cautionary tale, a reminder that power without accountability inevitably leads to corruption, and that even the most vulnerable members of society deserve protection from those who would harm them. But the more lasting legacy belongs to two young boys who refused to be silenced, a father who knew how to fight for justice, and a community that learned to stand together against injustice. Their story proves that sometimes the most important battles are fought not in courtrooms or legislatures, but on simple wooden benches where children just want to eat their lunch in peace. In the end, justice prevailed not because of any single heroic action, but because ordinary people chose to do the right thing when faced with extraordinary cruelty. The bench incident taught an entire community that true authority comes not from the power to intimidate and control, but from the responsibility to protect and serve those who need it most. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all.